Hey, Connor. Thanks
Hey,
for coming on.
yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, happy to. I know we've kind of talked a little bit about this, but I mean, obviously, this is like you and I have met now for 5 minutes, so we'll
Yeah,
get into like really getting to know each other. While we're doing the intro, in fact, I'll share my screen so that people can see maybe even just a little bit behind the kind of scenes of what I do to prepare. So I've become a bit of a Rome junkie over the past like month and a half, which is why I wanted to do the interview. And what's funny is I've had like a bunch of my friends come out to me and basically say the same thing, right? In fact, I got a text yesterday who's like, hey, do you know this Connor guy? Like, I want to invest in his company. What's it look like? What's going on? And I was like, yeah, actually, funny enough, I'm talking to him in a couple of days. And his like text to me was, everyone I introduced Rome to texts me within 48 hours and is like, holy shit, this like works the way my brain works. This is amazing.
yeah,
So hopefully we'll get into the Rome cult here, and you can see some of my notes that I've got here. When I do a podcast, you'll hear my clicking and clacking in the background as I'm writing notes, but I generally start with like a ton of questions and things that we can go into, and I'm just going to jump around as you say interesting things.
hmm
And the idea of this should be kind of like a dinner party, right? Where anybody listening to it is somebody that I trust that's going to give you the benefit of the doubt kind of thing, right?
hmm
And so I want to create an option for you to really be, pretty direct and authentic. Not that I think
hmm
you have a problem with that, but I'll follow the kind of interesting threads as you start talking about things.
Sounds great.
And my hope is we can talk about why Gnome's interesting, and then who are you, right? Like, what's your
Sure.
background, and yeah, what brought you to this point? And then you've obviously got a lot of kind of interesting philosophical beliefs and stuff. So we'll dive into some of those things. And then I've got your Twitter feed up and the change log up and the help database. So I'm kind of clicking around that to see what's interesting there. With this little kind of behind the scenes thing done, give me just like a quick overview of like what is Rome? How do you describe it to people who you meet on the subway and they don't know anything about it?
I mean, probably one of the more interesting quick ways to describe Rome isn't one that I came up with, but something that people have been tweeting in the last few days is we've been describing it as a magic junkyard, which is the core idea in Rome is that we want to allow people to have sort of do accretive knowledge work, or basically get compound interest on your notes. So being able to collaborate with, your past and future self, such that the work that you're doing, even if you're doing it in small batches, even if you're just trying to clearly articulate one idea or one question you have or one problem you're solving, make it really easy for you to remix your notes, find a bunch of things which you might have written about on a number of different pages or across a number of different days that all relate to the same topic. So, when you come to work on an area or come to focus on something that's interesting, it's really easy for you to aggregate all the information that you found in the past that might be relevant to it and sort of, remix the old scraps that otherwise might get lost in a tool like Evernote or Notion. And mix those together. So I've generally thought of Rome as like, we want to build a layer on top of the web of personal knowledge graphs where a person can represent the actual structure of their mind, like, how all these different ideas that they have or these different observations that they've made might be connected, and eventually be able to remix those. The product that we've launched right now is mostly a single player tool. We have a bunch of organizations that are using it as like a company wiki and a company to-do list and that kind of thing. But the core idea is that we want to create sort of remixable knowledge graphs for building up work over time.
Got it. Yeah, it's funny. About a day or two before I discovered Rome, I was tweeting out that I really wish somebody would make Emacs org mode for like normal people. And in many ways, Rome reminds me a lot of org mode. At least the kind of the text background, text first approach, the structure of different ideas and kind of snippets or whatever you call them. Was org mode like an inspiration?
That's not a total coincidence. I think I learned Emacs specifically for org mode when I heard about it, because I spent a few years sort of off in the wilderness trying to figure out how to solve some knowledge management problems that I'd run into running a research group, and also that I thought were sort of prerequisite problems for doing large scale collective intelligence work. And I was just playing with literally like every obscure tool that I could find, and I found org mode to be one of them in terms of general purpose knowledge management and hackability and extensibility and that kind of thing. So yeah, org mode's definitely been a big inspiration for us.
Where's the obsession with knowledge management come in?
Well, I think like Venkatesh Rao had a good sort of talk about foxes and hedgehogs, right? Like a hedgehog is somebody who has sort of a big top-down worldview. They have a few like strong beliefs, and when they see observations, they sort of fit those into that. But there's sort of another way of being where you're making a lot of discrete observations, and then you're trying to figure out how those pieces connect. And there's just been a lot of topics over time that were basically just a bit too big for my head. They were like problems that I was interested, where I was like, how do these things fit together? I had a really hard time just organizing. And so I had a sort of personal itch to scratch of just figuring out, what do I actually believe, and how do these things relate, and how does one thing that I see relate to other things that I see? So there was an itch there. But in general, I've also just been interested for maybe the past 12 years in how does a group of people come to have a shared model of the world such that they can act together.
Yep.
At a large scale, that's like, how do you make a government work? And like at a smaller scale, where you've got maybe 4 or 5 people who have a high degree of trust in one another, but are still trying to do a startup or something like that, and trying to figure out, okay, how do we map out this landscape? How do we figure out how to prioritize what features we should build and what the right way is to build them? And how does, one technical decision influence future technical decisions and those kinds of things? But in general, I think there's a Margaret Mead quote that says don't doubt the ability for a small group of people to change the world. That's the only thing that ever has, right? But I think that the problems that we sort of are facing at a society level are quite difficult, and often quite wickedly interconnected, and it's pretty hard for even groups of aligned people to fully map out a territory, or create some sort of representation of what they see in a territory, such that they can collaborate effectively. So that's I get a bit of where, for me, it seems like a sort of a meta problem that's important for all other problems, of if you can get your thoughts outside your head so that you can get a little bit of distance from them, and then sort of evaluate them separately from you, or show them to other people such that other people can help you error correct and give you a different perspective. Just seems like the highest leverage thing to help you work on every other problem, like ending aging or curing cancer, or dealing with climate change or terrorism or those kinds of things. So that's a bit where my knowledge management focus has come from.
I mean, if you think about the the Margaret Mead quote as almost being something that's kind of or not antithetical, but different than the way you see the world, right? If a small group of committed people is not the thing that's going to change the the next 100 years worth of challenges, then what that insinuates is that there's there's some sort of evolution going on, right? We're having an upgrade in culture, technology, or humanity that makes it so that we can have a larger group of committed people, or we can kind of interconnect more effectively. Is there any historical precedent for that? Maybe the printing press or something like that, but is there any kind of point where, our ability to organize, had a step function increase that is similar in philosophy to what you'd like Rome to be?
Yeah, I mean, there's a really great paper that I found through Brett Victor called Visualization and Cognition that makes the argument that the thing which caused the scientific revolution was, what the author Bruno Latour calls immutable mobiles. So the quote I like is in an agnostic debate, right? A debate between, 2 parties where, the other people that they're trying to convince don't have a prior opinion, able to gather the most faithful, well-aligned allies, right?
Okay.
We've had all these cultural practices that we talk about as being responsible for the Enlightenment, right? Culture, critique or whatever had existed for thousands of years before in a bunch of small places, but because of the challenge of, replication errors, when I tell you something, Chinese whispers game going on, you never got the scientific revolution. So his claim is that actually it was things like perspective drawing, right, and things like wood cutting that allowed for multiple replications of the same image, plus the printing press that actually allowed the scientific revolution to happen and for us to get a culture of science in the first place. And I buy that argument. I'm sort of a bit of a technological determinist in terms of culture, where it's we shape our tools and then after our tools shape us. So that's another place for me where it's sometimes you can create massive cultural change by changing the means of communication or changing the means by which people represent thought. And so there's another sense in which I think you want to build tools that sort of nudge us in the direction of better thinking. And ideally I think there's still a lot more than the change that happened with the printing press is there are changes that are possible, especially with hypermedia, that have yet to be realized, that are as great a change as the change from a pre-literate society to a literate society. And that's the sort of hope that I've got, is right now we don't have real hypermedia read write web, especially around like, complicated belief structures. So
yeah. So if you're a tech determinist, does that also mean that you're like a technical optimist? Are you optimistic about the arc of where technology goes, or do you think it's a neutral force that we shape?
Yeah, I would say it's like a bit of a neutral force. I think that there's a sense in which I think that the world is already governed by sort of a bunch of strong AGIs, right? If you think like, and those right now are mostly systems like capitalism and democracy, right? There are places where there are systems that are at play that are smarter than any one individual human, but don't necessarily have incentives aligned with like the human race, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there are plenty of places where like, well, if you don't build this company that is going to do like ad optimization, right, somebody else is going to build the company that does ad optimization, so you might as well do it, even though like the attention economy might like be perverse in a bunch of ways and like fucking up society. Like, there are these like larger systems at play that are hard for people to gain any sort of leverage over. So I do think that like tech can be like somewhat neutral, right? Or like, once incentives are set up, like people will play within them. But I think that it's a place where like you want to find some way to put your thumb on the scale and say like, okay, can we create new systems that are equally powerful, that have different incentives set up, such that like, yeah, we can get something that's slightly more aligned with human values.
Are you optimistic about that? About getting to alignment with human values?
Yeah, pretty. Yeah, I think so. I definitely think so. I think, like I like the idea like the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed, and like this whole idea of like you don't change things by fighting the existing reality. You change things by creating a new one that makes the old one obsolete. Like I like this. Like so I'm pretty optimistic about the potential. I don't think that it's something that you can just like sit back and like hope for the best. I think you kind of have to like work on it. But right. I'm optimistic about the potential of the web and
you don't see the like overwhelming forces kind of being insurmountable, right? Like you don't see the negative stuff being insurmountable.
No.
Sure. Well, so as you can tell, my sin tends to be curiosity, and I tend to ask very kind of ranging, weird questions. But I'll take it back to Rome here for a second. One of the things I'm pretty curious about, you alluded to the fox and the hedgehog thing earlier. I'm curious, does Rome work like better for particular types of brains or the ways people think? Are there things that you notice about people who just grok Rome, more easily?
I mean, right now we don't have a great onboarding flow, and so, there are folks who sort of enjoy the mystery of it, right? They like come and they like sense that it's like a power tool. They sense it's sort of like Excel for text. And so the folks who like currently who are like flocking to it tend to be a bit more autodidact, like tend to like have direct experience with the problem of like, I have struggled to figure out how to organize my thoughts. I have like felt a huge amount of friction when I'm using something like Evernote or Notion or like even like Airtable or whatever to try to like organize my thoughts in a strictly hierarchical, somewhat linear way. So I think, in terms of like our early adopter crowd, for sure, there are people who like already have felt frustration with the sort of incidental complexity or like artificial constraints that have existed in a lot of other tools that follow this sort of like file cabinet format. And so like, I think the early adopter crowd tends to be a bit more wide ranging in their interests. They're like, more interested in connections between topics, like a little bit like inherently interdisciplinary in their thinking. I think this is actually just like how the mind works, period. So, I think that as the tool becomes a little easier to learn, we'll see like a broader class of people using it. But I think that there's a certain like hunger and drive for like people who are pretty insatiably curious and trying to like actually understand things in the world and actually trying to write down their thoughts as a way of thinking, like not just as a way of presenting them to others, but like writing such that they can get a better understanding of what they think. That seems to be the Rome cult today.
Got it. And you mentioned that it's like, this is the way the brain works. Is that, do you think that's universal? Do you think this is, there are people who are much more hierarchical or structured first, or is this the way all of our brains work?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of our first investors was a guy named Alex Wright, who I think he's at Facebook now, but ran research for Etsy, and he wrote a great book called Glut, which is a history of all knowledge management going back to like Aristotle. Right. Okay. And I thought he like articulated really clearly that there's sort of two simultaneous ways that we end up inherently organizing thoughts in our mind. One is through taxonomies, right? Like hierarchical classifications of like, like genus, species, subspecies, those kinds of things. But that all of those classifications are in some sense artificial. Like, there's like fuzzy boundaries and there's places where these things overlap. And then the other way is through these graphs of just like, A implies B. If A implies B, then like that relationship implies C. So, there are, I think, pretty like fundamental operations that tools like Evernote or tools like Notion or tools like, like the standard files in folders format just like don't represent the like really basic data structures that exist somewhat naturally. And so I do think that that's like a sort of universal property of human minds, at least, is that like, we like to see categories, but those categories are not fixed. Like, the notes you take about a book on marketing that you read on your summer vacation that was recommended to you by your best friend, like those notes kind of belong with your best friend, and they kind of belong with your summer vacation, and they kind of belong with marketing, and they kind of belong in like all the book notes you have, right? And so to have to decide what file to put that in and try to organize that stuff with tags is a like, yeah, an artificial constraint.
Got it. Are there people that like reject Rome? Like, have you gotten any of the people who are just like, no, this is absolutely wrong?
I mean, I like have, a bunch of like public Twitter fights with Tiago.
He seems to be like kind of neutral though, right? He seems like he's got his system, but he doesn't seem like he is going to shut down. Like, no, Rome's broken. Rome doesn't work.
Yeah, no, I think, I think partially because, like we're still like in the grand scheme of things pretty small, like, it's not millions of users yet. So we haven't had any I think there are folks who like, it's pretty opinionated software, right? So there are certain things that we do where like we create a daily note for you every day, right? Yep. Like just like when you're on the tool, because we think that's a pretty good default location for any idea that you have, is you just like put it in the daily note and like you nest it underneath like certain tags or links to, other subjects that you're talking about, but you sort of have this temporal log of things. And some of the people even who use it really frequently, like just reject the daily note idea, right? They want to like have things in subject matter files.
Sure.
And so there will be like particular features like that. And people will be like, like it's, when most of the time their frustration is with like, I'm not sure what to use this for or how to use this yet.
Yeah.
And so I think there's the first stage is like, first they ignore you. So the folks who are like not into Rome seem to just like bounce off of it of like, I'm frustrated by this blank page. I don't know how to start, but they're not like vehemently opposed to it. They're just confused.
So if first they ignore you and then they fight you, where do you think the fights are going to, where are they going to come from?
I mean, I think there's a there's a paradigm that we're trying to break, which is this paradigm of you have to choose the file to write your stuff in before you have the idea, right? You have to decide of the classification of the idea before you have the idea. And so, we're pretty opinionated on this idea of like, well, like let's break it down one level and just say like each individual thought, right? Each individual, in Rome, it could be a bullet point or like a level of indentation or a paragraph, right? Like each one of those is going to be atomic and something that can be, referenced on a number of different pages, and based on how it's, indented, like is going to just appear in the backlink section of many pages. So yeah, like that's a little bit, of a different kind of paradigm from a lot of the other notes. And I think, yeah, like it requires some changes in your mental model to like actually start switching over. But yeah, I don't know exactly where the fight is going to be. I think it's just like yeah.
I have an idea at this point. So like people who are listening here who have not like played with Rome,
Mm-hmm.
This is going to be the first one where I try to record video. So we'll see if this works. But do you mind sharing your screen and opening up either your Rome or the help database? And
Sure.
Maybe we can kind of run through it and show people
Sure.
what it is and what it looks like. And then I can ask you some of the product questions in situ.
Yeah. So this is it's funny, like last night at like 1 a.m., I decided to actually start mapping out some of our open questions, some of the things that like, because I think I have a little bit of someone on Twitter called me the Nassim Taleb of like knowledge management. And I can sound a little arrogant sometimes. So I wanted to write down like some of the open questions we have that we haven't solved yet. So this is actually just my Rome where I decided to like sort of publicly say like, we're in the middle of like interviewing designers and wanting to hire an additional user interaction designer. So here I was actually just writing out some of the sort of hypotheses we have about some features coming in the future and some like overarching patterns between certain kinds of problems that we think users are going to want to and need to be able to solve. And so these are just some of my notes that I published yesterday, or like, this morning actually.
So let's start right now. We're looking at the start page, like the core set of the health database, which is basically you've got this kind of cool building and public thing that I'll ask more about if we have time to. It make it interesting, but it starts at this idea of daily notes, right? Is what you're talking about, kind of creating notes for folks.
Yep.
And the idea is like if there's a place to dump your thoughts, that's the place to do it, right?
Yep. Exactly.
And so let's run through kind of what the first, like, what's the experience of, like, you wake up in the morning, you load Roam, you have a thought you want to record from the night before. What's that experience look like?
I mean, like when I'm doing it, right? So if I hop into my daily notes for today, and I minimize this whole thing, the way that I tend to do things, because I like to break my day down by, by time. So, I might just put in a note like,
it's Tyler.
Yep.
Willis, like what you're talking about, Willis.
If I'm like taking notes on our meeting, right? Like I'm basically just going to, create some meeting notes and zoom in on those and just like write my thoughts from this meeting right now, So, so that's basically how I'm going to like quickly do things. And so the reason that I create these tags, right? So I create these tags with this, double brackets, or, if you forget that, you would just do page reference in this, what some folks have called the good shit command, which is that slash. But so this lets me just, and now if I hit Control O, I'm going to just navigate to the meeting thing. And so I've got like notes from a couple meetings that I've published, right? In this case, it's fake, right? I don't actually record my meeting notes in my
public one.
In my public one. But like, I can jump back here and I can say, well, in my demo page where I was writing about Roam for Life logging, I put the meeting, who the people are, and say like, like these things, right? And so like Will thinks the best book is Eat That Frog. And like have my notes on Eat That Frog.
And these are the same things you might put in a notebook, like a physical notebook you were tracking. Just here's the thoughts I'm having. I'm just brain dumping. I'm just putting it down. But if you've got something that is a topic that links to something, it's a person or it's a book or something, then it creates this page, right?
And then for instance, like, if I put Tiago Forte, right? Maybe somebody that I written in my fake meeting, I can suddenly just pull up all the notes I have about Tiago, from like other days, or this was a to-do I had, right, where like in reading this book I thought like they were talking about rate limiting on steps, and I was like, this reminds me of like this theory of constraints post from him. So so anyways, I end up being able to get sort of an aggregate view over like all my interactions with a particular person over time.
One of the things that I think is really powerful, if we can go back to one page over, or just to anything where there's links. One of the things I think that's really powerful is this concept that you talk about of compound interest in thinking. And these unlinked references, I think, are kind of the critical point of that, right? Which is that text, if it finds it anywhere, you're going to be able to see where you haven't explicitly said this is related to X. But the software is prompting you to understand, is this related or not?
Exactly. You shouldn't have to. This is in like, early prototypes of Roam, right? I link everything. Right, like I'm gonna, anytime there's a topic that I think is pretty interesting that I might come to it in the future, I'll make a page for it. But you can't know ahead of time what's going to be interesting, right? So if I decide later on I'm interested in like, if I decide later on I'm interested in a particular topic and I search for it, like 102 unlinked references for productivity, it's probably not going to be as useful. This is going to be a huge thing. But I could then filter this thing and I could say, okay, what are the thoughts on productivity that relate to something that, for instance, Paul Graham has said, right? And I can suddenly, focus my attention on just, the 3 things from Paul Graham essays where people were talking about productivity, or where he was talking about productivity, right?
The thing that I think is like really powerful about this, you may have said this publicly, I can't remember, is it seems, I don't know whether it is actually fighting entropy and reducing it, or if it just has less entropy than kind of traditional note-taking systems. But it seems like basically it creates this point where the more you put into it, hopefully the more you discover later, the more interconnected this thing gets. Is that reasonable?
Yeah. I think that's the like challenge, the like beef I have with with people who are like, oh, you need to follow this particular system in Evernote, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, you need to have a folder for, and I think there's plenty of advantages to having a folder for, you know, your projects and like particular areas you're focused on. But like when suddenly, like there have been plenty of times for me when I used other tools or when I was just like organizing, you know, my Google Docs or like organizing my Word documents in folders, where I would realize I wanted a different structure, and I would sort of have to, you know, like destroy the whole old organizational paradigm in order to like reorganize all my files.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you know, if I changed my mind afterwards, I'd have to do just as much work to try and get it back.
Sure.
And so I think, you know, there's many different indexes into like how you're thinking about structuring your thoughts. You should be able to have a bunch of those things operate concurrently, and then sort of like look at intersections of them to find, you know, like new and interesting patterns you weren't expecting. So
I mean, it's funny. This is I spend obviously most of my days thinking about, you know, patterns and data structure and such, and we call these perspectives, right? You should be able to look at your data with different perspectives over time. Exactly. It strikes me that like compared to Evernote, this is going to be a weird statement, but Roam feels more 3D and Evernote feels more 2D. Mm-hmm. And I think the kind of graph structure is a large part of that. Yep. Why is graph overview like a top level item? It's the second item. It's always visible no matter what, right? What is the graph overview, and why is that so core?
Well, I mean, to be fair, I think the graph overview needs a ton of work. You know, one of the reasons that we put it up over here was just because it's a sort of a perspective on the structure of your whole database. I'm pretty sure my graph overview for help is going to be garbage because it's such a huge database. And to be honest, like, you know, we have a lot of work to do on this feature.
Well, the reality is like you launched out of functionally alpha or beta like 2 months ago, 3 months ago, something like that.
Yeah, well, it's January now. I think we started making like allowing public beta invites in middle of October. So I guess we have, you know, October, November, December to January. So like 2.5 months.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, and this was something that we'd had in a bunch of earlier versions. We'd stripped out, but then, you know, some of our alpha users were sort of like crying to get it back because they just liked to be able to see the like overall taxonomy of their notes. This view is the directed graph layout where it's sort of looking at the overall hierarchy of things. And so I can go look at, you know, if I shift click on a note, it'll open it up in the sidebar. And I've got the date picker in here down there. So if I click on one of these dates, it'll convert, but let's remove that because I like that date picker existing. But then if I view this as a coast layout, this is the like Coast Belcanto graph layout algorithm. And yeah, like this Roam is a pretty huge one. And so this just gives you like a sort of constellation of how your ideas are clustered. And, you know, I can view this accordingly. If I remove the log days, which is where I do most of my Roam, then you'll just see. So this is sort of just giving me a constellation of like how a bunch of different thoughts are related. So I can sort of just like browse through like what people are saying, be like, oh, that's connected to conspiracy theories. And like, these are some of the people who are on the endorsement page. This is like an essay on like, you know, how to develop transformative tools for thought that relates to reason, right? Yeah. So it's just a like, mostly this tool is for fun right now. I would say that like there's a huge amount like capability that we want to pour into this in terms of being able to, you know, query a particular subgraph or, you know, like navigate directly through the graph and like have a bunch of, you know, better visualizations. But like people tend to just enjoy looking at the high level structure of their sort of mind palace. And I think that it's important to build tools that are just fun, right? And like that people enjoy using, and a lot of our users get a lot of pleasure from watching this graph grow and just seeing like, oh, well, like here's a couple clusters of ideas. I haven't done much work to connect them yet. Let me like think about the connection between like, you know, this constellation and like this other constellation over here, and see how I bridge these together. So just like it's more of a like delight feature currently than something that I think is necessarily going to be giving people like, you know, a huge amount of daily value. But emotional energy is its own sort of value. So
do you think it'll give daily value in the future? I mean, this kind of idea of navigating feels core in a way. It feels like it's part of the rewiring of the brain.
Yeah, I think I think there's like if I go and visit, let's just go visit this note. If I open up my like little subgraph view over here.
Or is Murphy's laws of demos? They always go wrong.
It's always a little tricky too when you're dealing with like Zoom taking up most of the bandwidth on my computer. Like if I click on design challenges, that'll probably pull the graph up. Or not. We'll wait. Sidescape's being weird. So
all good.
But yeah, there's I think there's a lot of opportunities in these like smaller, in viewing the more particular subgraph and exploring things through there.
Yeah, it's funny. I think there's I don't know exactly what the formulation is, but I think there's like a 2, 3, or 4 step guide that you could write that was like how to be an interesting thinker, right?
Yeah.
And I think of maybe Tyler Cohen's the like a good example of somebody like this, but it's consume a lot of information, kind of infovore style.
Yeah.
And then think about and process that information, preferably in writing format, whether it's a link blog or a Roam database or what have you. And then look for ways to kind of connect those, because it feels like it's a lot like wiring kind of neurons for thought, right? Like you're starting to build up this, that relates to this and this relates to that. And now I can kind of see how all 4 of those things, make me believe that X is true, right?
Yep.
And I think that's one of the reasons I think Roam gets such a kind of cultish devotion, is because it makes that easier, right?
Yep.
And I'm like, who are the when you think about kind of Roam thinkers, who are the best Roam thinkers that you know or follow or have seen, even if they aren't Roam users? I'm thinking of maybe Tyler or Venkatesh or the Zettelkasten guy, if I pronounced that right.
Oh yeah, like Sanka Aarons. I mean, I think I'm really looking forward to the day that we get Tyler Cowen using it, or hopefully like an Eric Weinstein or those kind of folks. Who are doing a bunch of interdisciplinary thought and sort of looking for elegant abstractions over a bunch of different domains. I think honestly, like I am, one of the things that I really have liked about Jordan Peterson, for example, is he had this whole idea of trying to find things like patterns which apply across a bunch of different fields. I can't remember exactly the term that he was using for this, but he was like, okay, well, if this pattern appears in like evolutionary theory and also in like Jungian like psychoanalysis and also in like the Big Five personality test, which is like like the best sort of most like falsifiable type of personality test or those kinds of things. Like if a pattern appears in a bunch of different domains, or you can see some set of archetypes appearing in like Joseph Campbell did, right? Joseph Campbell, who's the sort of comparative mythologist who was looking for story patterns that were falling across like Native American mythology and European mythology and like South Asian or East Asian mythology. And he was like, okay, well, when these narrative arcs are the same across a bunch of those, it represents some deeper underlying pattern in human psychology. The folks who are doing that kind of work are the ones that I think of as sort of like the quintessential Roam thinkers, right? I mean, you also see this for folks that are like, you mentioned before the call that you've done some work with hedge funds, right? Like people who are trying to figure out, okay, like what's an abstract model that has explanatory power in a few different domains. I like David Deutsch's sort of work on this. But yeah, in terms of, I think Roam thinkers that I know that are using the tool that are pretty fantastic, right? Like Venkatesh Rao is a great one. Visakan V is, Aaron Lewis, I think he's just at AZL. Kevin Simler, like folks who are doing a bunch of just thinking about really interesting topics and reading really widely on them, and then looking for intersections. I've felt pretty fortunate that a bunch of the writers who I've been reading a ton of in the past 5 years have started using the tool for their writing, which has been a pretty delightful for me. Particularly Venkat and Kevin are folks who I've read a lot, and I like their thinking. So it's really nice to build a tool that helps them think more.
It feels like with the rise of Twitter, there was kind of this push towards more public intellectualism.
Yeah.
Maybe this is just recency bias where that's when I became aware of it.
Yep.
But it does seem like there's kind of a renaissance happening of public intellectualism.
Yep.
And it feels like a lot of the folks that are doing that, even even on some of the more practical levels, like a Tiago maybe,
Yep.
a lot of those folks are going through this. What I would say is they're kind of empowered by the ease of writing and sharing and
Yep.
the wealth of information that exists. The Infovore stuff from Tyler Cohen.
Yep.
Is that part of why kind of now is the time to discover Rome? Like why was Rome discovered now and not discovered or built or invented or whatever word you want to use 50 years ago?
I mean, there's like, I think there's also like technical reasons, right? Like there's been a lot of progress. It's funny. It was pretty funny. Like Dan Abramoff, who was the guy who created Redux, which is like this sort of, most popular framework for building React applications, was tweeting about how he wanted Rome as an IDE the other day, which was hilarious because it was through Dan Abramoff that I discovered ClojureScript. And, when I was first getting into React and started thinking about like ways of building complex web applications in a way that, a small team could maintain a pretty complicated, UI, especially one that's exploratory where we're trying to figure out a lot of stuff. So I think there's been a bunch of things that have made it much easier for smaller teams to build pretty complicated web apps, and make those performant and do the collaboration stuff and, so I think there's been a bunch of things that have like allowed you to do more unorthodox and untested web applications. That's been pretty helpful. I think that's one reason that we were able to build it now. But I wasn't able to build Rome in 2009 when I was doing my first company and we were building it on Ruby on Rails and just using jQuery, right? That was a little bit more difficult to build an app like this, especially when we're figuring out so much stuff, right? And trying to do a bunch of UIs that haven't existed before. So I think there's multiple reasons that for that, but I think the rise in sort of public intellectualism outside of the university context, where people aren't just purely incentivized to publish papers and incentivized to have a super niche target audience where you've got a bunch of politicking, and that is in some ways more significant than your ability to clearly articulate an idea for a lay audience. Yeah, both of those things kind of help quite a bit.
Yeah, it's funny. There's things I hate about the attention economy, but one of the things I like is that it's created an incentive for sharing these things, right? That used to only exist in contexts where there was, political or kind of corporate benefit to do so.
Yep.
And generally only political in the academic system.
Yeah.
I want to switch gears into something else, but before I do that, when you think about this kind of idea of the rise of public intellectualism, these kind of trends that are pushing towards this, and you think about this kind of tech determinism that is a kind of core belief you have mentioned earlier. Is this kind of intellectualism as a habit or improving the kind of mind, the mind production function kind of tie that we're talking about in these folks, is that accessible to everyone? Is that learnable? Is that someone can people become a thinker, or is this something that people are kind of naturally wired towards?
Yeah,
probably a bit of both. But
I think so. I had over Thanksgiving break. I had about a 6-hour writing session that I just did in our public health database, where I was sort of talking about use cases and sort of underlying philosophy, and I was talking about this idea of doing science on your life, right? Where science is the search for good explanations that cover a broader range of things that have explanatory power, have predictive power over, more things than just the initial data that you were looking at to come up with that explanation. And I think Rome has had a pretty, a reasonably technical, early adopter audience, right? We started actually in the AI research community. And so, but even there, we see a lot of people who are just doing a ton of journaling in it and then looking for patterns across their journal entries, right? So they're writing about their emotional lives and their relationships and looking for, patterns in interaction that they're having over time of if I'm getting in a fight with, my fiance, being able to look at my gratitude list and filter on her name and just remember okay, let me load into my working memory like all the things that are really great in this relationship, as opposed to, the recency bias of like the fight that we're having right now. Right. And we've seen, like one of our earliest users was originally like getting into Rome because she was writing a chapter in a medical textbook, but then started actually just like using it primarily for journaling to deal with, the emotional fallout of her father dying and thinking about that relationship, and then noticing a bunch of really interesting patterns in like her feelings around like guilt and shame and like power. And so I think there are habits of mind that are not like default, like this desire to say like, let me challenge my preconceptions. Like, let me see whether the explanation I have for how things are happening fits with the evidence. And let me try to like consider new potential frames on it. I think there are like a lot of mind habits that you're not going to like automatically get from any sort of technical tool, but hopefully if we make affordances to make those sort of behaviors really easy, then it's easier for people to like one of the reasons I like computer science in general is it's a place where you can get like a physical handle on very abstract concepts, right? You can like actually like, reify abstractions and then like just like mess with those in code and like, put some data through it and see if it works for a bunch of different kinds of data and that kind of thing. And so I think if we make a tool that makes it easier for people to do those sort of like abstract behaviors, but actually like see immediate tangible benefit from them, then, like it's a lot better than just like telling people to like have a more scientific mindset or something.
Yeah. It's funny. It reminds me of one of my kind of theories about reading, which is if you're taking notes on things and writing them and understanding them, then that becomes part of understanding a book better and learning from it. But it's actually not about specific knowledge that you're pulling out of books. It's a lot of it's just you're rewiring your brain by reading it. So a lot of people can just write and get a lot of this benefit, but they get more of it if they're using a tool like Roam to make it easier to kind of find those interconnections and those abstractions. Cool. Well, I want to switch gears a little bit into you.
Okay.
You called yourself kind of the Nassim Taleb of knowledge.
I didn't call myself that. I didn't call myself that. Yeah.
Other people. The way I wrote this down in my Roam notes prepping for this was you seem fairly committed to a concept that I'm broadly thinking of as either like individualism or liberty, both of which I'd say are kind of loaded words that are probably something you should accept. What is a better way of understanding kind of your mode of operating? Like you seem pretty iconoclastic or driven or direct or self-confident or arrogant or whatever you want to call it. Sure. What is that?
Well, I mean, on the like, I tweeted this. I liked this guy, Nate Soares, who I think runs research at the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, has this idea of confidence all the way up. So like the ability to appear like, or like the fact that certain things like read socially as confident when you're being still clear about like how much error there is in your models or like how much like limited data that there is. But if you have confidence in like I might not have confidence that like the thing that I'm saying is true, but I have confidence in like my epistemic certainty of it, right? Of like okay, like given X, Y, and Z, then like B is true, and I think that there's like some like probability range for like X, Y, and Z to be true.
I'm 51% confident B is true, and everyone goes, "Wow, he really knows what he's talking about."
Yeah, exactly, right. And so I think there's a like I have where I don't have confidence in my facts, I have confidence in my reasoning, and where I don't have confidence in my reasoning, I have confidence in my like support structure in terms of like the other people that I spend a lot of time with who like very vehemently disagree with me, and like aren't about to be like I like this idea of like a rationalist is someone who would rather not get their way because they can't persuade people than get their way through force. And so I like tend to surround myself with like pretty like opinionated people that are like not easily convinced by like my like forceful nature. So I like am forced to like try and be articulate in my ideas and update when they're seeing things that I'm not seeing. So I have a lot of, so I think there's also a sense in which like one of the problems I have with like libertarianism or like individualism, particularly, the kind that I think is like the water that we're swimming in the United States, where like we're extremely individualistic compared with every other country and every other society that's ever existed,
Yep.
And I think that this is like just not a true reflection of like human nature. Like, you know, you're the average of the people you spend the most time with to some extent, right? Like, you know, we're shaped by our interactions and by our relationships. And so I don't really buy into this, like there's no such thing as a self-made man or a self-made woman, right? Like everyone is also a product of their environment, and a product of the like agency that they have in shaping their environment and deciding who they're going to associate with and those kind of things. So I used to like identify a lot as like a libertarian socialist of like, basically the thing that I care about is not just individual autonomy, but autonomy for groups. So the ability for a group of people to say, these are the constraints that we want to put on our lives. Like freedom can also come from constraints. Freedom is not purely like there's Scott Alexander has a great sort of post on this on like, I think atomic communitarianism, where like, you know, if you're trying to go on a diet and somebody in your office is bringing in donuts every morning and it's creating huge taxes on your attention and your willpower, like, you know, they're not in a like traditional, you know, like non-aggression principle, like violating your rights or like violating your sovereignty, but they're adding a bunch of complexity to your environment that's going to make it harder for you to achieve your goals. So I think it's also important for people to be able to set constraints for themselves and, you know, collectively opt into certain like structures, right? That can limit choice and therefore like free up a bunch of cognitive power. So,
Okay.
I don't know if that totally answers the question of like, I think, yeah, where I'm confident, it's like not necessarily like, it's a distributed confidence, right? It's like confidence in, you know, some of the like things that which I think, you know, our team is seeing that other organizations haven't seen. And there's a little bit of a like, you know, anger at the status quo that comes out a bunch. But, you know, I don't claim that we like, a system that's good at error correction is going to make more errors. But if you've got a system that you trust to do error correction well, I would rather sort of like loudly state my opinions and then there's this, I think it's Cunningham's law, right? Like the best way to get an answer on the internet is to to answer a question on the internet is like sort of boldly proclaim the wrong answer. Yeah. And so I find that like error correction works a little bit better when I am not like, what's the term that I'm thinking of? Like just putting like caveat after caveat after caveat and like not actually clearly saying what I think. I'd rather just like say what I think and hopefully get some, you know, opinionated people to put up some counter arguments and potentially like strong opinions, weakly held kind of thing. Yeah.
Do you, so this is going to be this is going to sound mean and I don't intend it to. Sure. Do you consider yourself likable?
I consider myself like polarizing, I guess. Like I find that the people who like me really like me and the people who don't really don't. And like, I do think that sort of like the opposite of love is indifference. And I'd rather like put forward myself as clearly as I can and sort of like put that out as sort of like a, you know, a resonator of like, you know, here's the frequency I'm operating on. And if you like it, you like it. And if you don't, you don't. So I do find that like the people around me tend to like me a lot and I tend to like them a lot. And so,
and people who don't opt out.
Yeah. And that's like, and that I guess goes again with the sort of like atomic communitarianism thing is just like, well, like if you don't like me, you don't have to spend time with me. You don't have to listen to me. Like, just like block me, like mute me, like that's fine.
Right.
Like, yeah.
Because I think, you know, part of this thing, you answered the question in part, at least on the kind of intellectual level of, you know, what does this all mean and how do you think about it? How do you have error correcting systems and how do you get to the right answer? Right.
Yeah.
But I think part of what this, you know, I find you like gravitating, like there's a likability.
Thanks.
To it.
I appreciate that. I like you too, John.
Thanks. I appreciate it. But it's not like the stuff that reads as confident or arrogant, depending on which side of the debate you're on.
Yeah.
Like it's not just the thinking, right? It's also the fact that, you know, you're, when you take a Zoom call with Tiago, like I knew you were going to be outside smoking a cigarette when we were talking because you did it with Tiago, right?
Yeah.
And it's kind of just like, yeah, here I am, and you know, take it or leave it, right? And I caught what I assume is only what I assume is your fiance who like walked outside, and I saw you just had a little look on that.
Yeah.
Like where does that confidence to be yourself come from? Like, that's something I think a lot of people don't have.
Yeah, I think like my mom probably. I don't know. Like I think like.
Tell me about your childhood.
Holding
Like,
me
what
up
was
as
growing up like?
holding me up as a little kid and be like, look at the beautiful baby sort of thing. Like, I think, I knew my parents had my back. I think
Okay.
that's one thing that I was pretty fortunate about. My mom was an illegal immigrant. She came to the U.S. without a visa and like sold hot dogs in front of the Liberty Bell and like was pretty like anti-authoritarian,
Cool.
and like very like resistant to a lot of the sort of like structures that you see from like traditional education. I went to public school, but like when I got in trouble, there was usually a sort of implicit assumption that they were going to have my back. Like even if we would fight really violently, like there was a high degree of trust. So I think that's pretty. I think that's a place where I've just got a huge amount of privilege of like knowing that like there have been people who will have my back even if I'm doing something that is not like love is not dependent on following convention, right?
Yeah.
Or like love is not dependent on like love and like some amount of social acceptance is not dependent on like following a particular life script that involves going to the right schools and getting the right job and like that kind of thing. And I think that's a place where I've been really blessed. Like I've just been like really fortunate to have some of that privilege, and so I want to like use that to create affordances for people who like may not have had that kind of thing. So
Yeah. Well, the kind of the psychological foundation of safety is very big, very important.
But then there's a flip side of that too, where it's like I also like did just experience a lot, like a huge amount of challenges as a young kid, and like a huge amount of like desire to prove myself, which I think was also just as helpful in terms of like getting that sort of like fire in the belly of like fuck you, like you say I can't do this and I'm gonna do it anyways just to show you. Like
where'd that come from?
I like hit puberty really late, and so I was just like the smallest kid in high school, and just like not particularly strong, but I like decided that I was gonna wrestle because it was like the best workout I could possibly get. And there were a lot of people who were like, yeah, you're going to quit. Like, you can't handle it. And I was just like, well, fuck you. Like, no, like I'm going to do this thing. And spent like about like, I think it was about 2.5 years after I started wrestling before I ever won a match. But like, fortunately like got stronger and learned some moves that like worked well for my body type and was able to eventually like do pretty well. But being able to like go through a long period of darkness of like not having any external validation or not having any external success, and then like see that through to get some victories, I think was pretty helpful for doing startups where you're going to go like any sort of research space. So there's going to be a really long period of self-doubt, like, oh, like nobody else has solved this yet. Is this actually even a like solvable problem? Like what the hell makes me think that like I'm able to solve this, like that kind of stuff.
I get the like I'm reading tea leaves here, so tell me if I'm wrong, but I get the read that there's a chip on your shoulder in that answer, right? Like the wrestling was not because it was a good workout, right? It was a lot of the seeing through the dark night was proving somebody else wrong, right?
And I think that's just as I'm really grateful for Tiago, for example, right? For like the rivalry that we've got, where some of my best writing last year was, he would say some things in defense of Evernote, right, that I thought were just completely ridiculous, and the anger at someone being so wrong and leading a bunch of people in the wrong direction was like a motivating force for like, no, like I can't let that thing just sit. So I do think that like some amount of competition or rivalry, like a nemesis is a great gift. So
who was your first nemesis? Like, where did that chip on the shoulder come from? Because like, you don't have to prove yourself to your parents; they love you. Like, where's that desire to really prove it, come from? Where's the fire in the belly?
Well, I mean, like there was this like one punk kid on the wrestling team, right, who was like a huge tough guy that was like, you're gonna quit, and I was like, fuck no, you're gonna, and he quit after 2 years, and I followed it through for 4 years. So there was like some amount of like rivalry there, but that wasn't, I don't know, there was already something there when that happened, so I couldn't quite replace that. Like I think I remember like trying to buy White Fang from like the bookstore, when I was like in pre-kindergarten, and like they wouldn't sell me the book because it was like beyond my reading level, and it's like
just like infuriated my mother, and like that sort of rage was like carried over into me. I also grew up like she came over from Ireland like in the middle of the Troubles. So like Ireland was sort of like the main like hotbed of terrorism because of and so I like grew up with a lot of stories of the British outlawing the Irish language, and like like Irish teachers having to like teach the language in the bushes, and like this whole like narrative of there has been one group of powerful people that have like tried to like destroy people like me, and I think that was like pretty formative when I was young, was like that sort of like desire for group autonomy as well, right? For like not just like individual autonomy or like individual liberty, but like stories of like, oh, like there was a huge surplus of grain during the entire potato famine when like millions of Irish people were dying, and they were exporting grain to England the whole time because plenty to feed everyone, but they wanted to make sure that the markets were working, and just felt like the world was better off with all these Irish people dying. So I think those stories were pretty formative too.
I can imagine that experience feeling a bit like your mom being the best ally you could ask for in a way, right?
Yeah.
Like she empowered you and trusted you and loved you fully in this point of security. But then she had an intolerance for the unfairness of the outside world.
Yeah.
So you two against the world kind of thing, right?
Yeah, that definitely was a thing for a while. Yeah.
Cool. What role does politics play in your life? Because you seem like you've had intermittent spurts of activity on that. 2008, you did a couple of things on it, and have been involved in Occupy in a way. Like what was it, friendly partisan for Andrew Yang? What role does politics play in your life?
I mean, I think politics is like, it's even intellectually like one of the most interesting spaces, right? Like I think like the human mind isn't even the most complex organism on earth, right? There are these like mimetic structures that like cause group identity to form, and there are these sort of like superorganisms of ideology or superorganisms of like shared narrative or shared stories that like end up influencing all the sort of individual cells which are humans. And I think that's like one of the most important things that's like going on in the world. I think I generally believe in evolution, right? And so one of the things that you want in a it goes back to error correction, right? And goes back to like the most important thing in governance is like you can't know ahead of time what policy or what ruler is going to like actually be successful. So you need to be able to remove those without violence and have like fast systems of error correction. And so I in general, I've sort of been a bit pro decentralization. So like, how can you do, like if like states are the laboratories of, democracy, right? Like city governments are even more so. So I've in general had a bias towards how do you enable more civic innovation? How do you enable more like experimentation in like what systems of government could look like? Because we've been doing the same thing for the last couple hundred years. There are clearly plenty of problems with it. It might be the best thing that's going right now is like this particular mix of democracy and capitalism, but like probably isn't the end of history. So I've been really interested in just like how's technology going to change that? Like what are those things? So yeah, my first startup was trying to create basically both collective intelligence and like common knowledge about what the desires of a particular like group of people were, with the hope that would influence like more rapid evolution in public policy. So the first company I started was called Localocracy. We because we went and talked to a lot of local leaders, we were like, all right, well, everyone's concerned about astroturfing. They're concerned about like some like Twitter mob that like doesn't actually relate to the city, like jumping in on an online ballot and like stacking the votes, or they're concerned about some public interest group that's like taking national attention and applying it to some local issue. And I really have just been interested in self-governance at like, the personal sovereignty level, but also the like collective sovereignty level to like potentially even like choose constraints. Like I love the Amish, right? The Amish are like, I'm really glad that the Amish exist, where like, they, especially because, they give freedom to the individuals raised in that community they force them to leave for a certain period and say like, if you want to be here, you have to opt in. We're going to like still raise you with our values and like show you what this way of life is like, but you have to like go out into the external world and see what's there and then decide whether you want to come back into this world that has additional constraints. So yeah, in general, like I've been sort of like, how can we use the internet to like make smarter and like more resilient, more adaptive like governance systems? So you know, my like first entry into politics was like some stuff I did. Basically, I was very motivated by the Obama campaign because I liked the way that they were using technology, and I liked to like I had a lot of hope that after Obama was elected, the sort of infrastructure that had been put in place to get him elected would be like converted into sort of a bottom-up information system that would like allow some of that experimentation. But that didn't quite happen. I was like, you know, on a like more libertarian side, like involved with like the campaign to decriminalize marijuana in Massachusetts. So like, you know, before I got into startups, I was doing more political stuff. But then, yeah, from there, I've sort of been like, well, I think like the particular point of leverage where I've got on these things is not in like just, you know, helping a particular campaign. It's like trying to build infrastructure that could, you know, empower people to do a different kind of decision making or a different kind of analysis. So yeah, like I'm similarly like currently a big fan of Dominic Cummings in the EU, and the which, you know, is definitely controversial because like Twitter at least does not like Brexit. I thought there were some very compelling arguments for Brexit particularly from David Deutsch, who I respect a lot, around this stuff. But in general, I also just really like Dominic Cummings was similarly influenced by Michael Nielsen and Brett Victor, who were some of the, I think, are like, you know, best living thinkers. And so the fact that there's someone who's trying to, you know, get call the weirdos into government and figure out ways to do, you know, dynamic documents and seeing rooms and like, you know, ways of getting policy that changes as the facts change, which I think is pretty critical for getting to a world that we're happier in. So.
I wouldn't have guessed you thought there were good arguments for Brexit. I would have like, and actually I find some of my favorite people kind of that are politically aware tend to have very hard to map beliefs because it's not like, oh, you go this way or that way, right? So what's the good argument for Brexit? Why pro Brexit, if I can ascribe that to you?
Okay, so I think if you want to understand Brexit, I tweeted a little bit about this, but I think there's a video, it's like about 45-minute interview with David Deutsch, who's this, he's a quantum physicist, but like has written a lot about Karl Popper, who's like, you know, pretty famous in philosophy of science, but also wrote a lot about politics. You know, he's a book called The Open Society. I think that's what it's called. And yeah, like his 45-minute interview, like definitely like changed my opinion on a bunch of things. The main thing that he was
Brexit and error correction is the video.
Yep. And I basically I'll parrot some of his arguments here, but basically one of the things that has been really good about Britain, in particular, and it's funny because like, you know, when I was growing up, I was just like extremely anti-Britain.
I can imagine.
Like extremely like Britain is the cause of like all like British imperialism is like the cause of all injustice and inequity in the world, and like, you know, like the British Empire is just something to be like scorned.
I had a strong Irish identity growing up, so I know what you mean.
Yeah. So it was interesting because like he makes some good arguments for some things that are particularly special about Britain, and one of the main things he talks about is like, one, there are certain ways in which the EU is an incredibly unaccountable system of government, where, you know, like it is really not clear who is responsible for any particular decision. There's not a like clear stance of like, you know, so-and-so is putting forward some idea, and like if they are wrong, they're going to be removed. Like there's this, the fact that there's so many layers between the actual decision making that's happening and the will of the people, I think is pretty problematic. And one of the things he talks about is just like, you know, amongst Western European countries, like Britain even tried socialism in a much more extreme way than anybody else in Western Europe, but didn't have the same long-term costs that Eastern Europe had, right? Like it didn't slide into totalitarianism. It didn't slide into, you know, they did socialism pretty, you know, fully immediately following World War II, but because they had the system of error correction where, you know, and part of that is first past the post, but mostly it's just, you know, if you put forward these ideas and these ideas don't work, you can just pretty quickly lose an election. And so certain things remained after that experiment that the British people are pretty happy about, like the national healthcare system.
Sure.
But like certain other experiments around education, like failed pretty miserably and were removed. And you don't see that kind of experimentation in the EU. The EU is sort of designed to be much more like static and much less like, let's try a thing and then let's undo it. So one of the things he talked about is like even the, like even the way Brexit was called, right, was like related to this sort of like unaccountability, thing, right? Where David Cameron was like, well, I'm not responsible for Brexit, but like we'll put it to the vote and then, we'll get the will of the people. And then the fact that after Brexit happened, the Leave camp or the Remain campaign didn't immediately become a rejoin campaign, didn't become a like, okay, well, we're going to leave. That's what people have voted. Let's like not call this whole system into question. Like, let's not like challenge the whole legitimacy of our government structure. Let's actually do what the people voted for, but then make the best case for rejoining as quickly as possible. Like all the concerns about Brexit are often like just introducing fear, uncertainty, and doubt and making predictions about, well, the experts say X, Y, and Z will happen. It's like, well, we can't really know what's going to happen. Like we should try it. And if it's bad, we should rejoin. But I think his concern around basically the lack of sovereignty, right? The fact that like, on all sorts of issues, you can't, like you couldn't implement like some of the like radical experiments that immediately followed World War II in terms of socialism when you have a like higher level governance structure that is telling you what you can and can't do, and like setting regulations for you and setting, and it was also interesting, right, when he was discussing the like, a lot of the arguments for Remain were almost like guilt by association, right? They were like, well, like some racists want to leave, therefore the folks who want to leave must be racist. Not even acknowledging the fact that like Britain is probably one of the least racist countries in the European Union. The other countries, there's like far, far more explicitly racist countries that are having an influence on the overall policy. So I think that, yeah, basically bias towards, bias towards the ability to fail fast, bias towards accountability for the people who are putting forward policies, and like, and the fact that like the EU has so much like additional layers of secrecy of like backroom meetings and like, consensus building, and like it's not as good a system for error correction from government. And I also think that, yeah, like there's plenty of reasons that like you don't need economic relationships in terms of, free trade or in terms of like trading partnerships to be tied in with reduction of sovereignty for an individual nation. So I think that relates to like Canada is not about to join, as the 51st state so they can get like 3 points on their GDP, right? There's no reason for Canada to sacrifice their sovereignty to, the United States federal government in order to have some like better relationships as a trading partner. So I think that's my like overall, but in general, I tend to have a bias towards like, I think there's lots of important things about, international cooperation and like Interpol and NATO and those things, but like, those aren't sacrificing sovereignty for the individuals, and they aren't reducing experimentation or basically these feedback loops of political legitimacy where someone can clearly articulate a position, and if they're wrong, they're removed from office.
Yeah.
And so that's the thing that I think is why like Brexit was a good idea.
It's argument for an error correction system, for like for some systemic like kind of structures that allow for better error correction.
And control gives you that, right? So like, people when they actually have, like when the people actually have control over their government in a more direct way, right? And there's more control being placed in, Parliament as opposed to in the EU governing body where you don't have any control. And what are you're going to change your representative that goes there, but like they're still just going to be making backroom deals with other folks that you've never heard of in Brussels, right? So
well, I mean, control allows you to have whatever control moves towards, right?
Yeah. And in the case of Britain was using that control in an effective error correction system, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
And what's interesting about this is, in fact, I would argue that this might be one of those points of I'm 51% confident and people read it as confident, which is you're not confident that 5 years from now, if there was an actual leave, that there wouldn't be a rejoin. It's not like you're saying this is a good idea, it's going to turn out well. You're saying it's an experiment, they should be allowed to run it.
Exactly. And like if the people voted for it and they experimented, and I think this is one of the reasons where like the Tories just crushed it in the last election, is because people were like, hey, we voted for this thing. like we voted for this thing and you guys just are completely ignoring us, like, and, you know, saying like, well, this is like, you know, Facebook and blah, blah, blah. Like, this is like there's some excuse for why the people who voted shouldn't be listened to. And it's like, that's just total bullshit. It's like, well, no, like people voted for leave.
So what does that mean for 2016 American politics? Because there was such a tie together in this idea of nativism and change and Trump being about drain the swamp and change things, right? Like it seems like we're at a rock the boat moment politically globally. How do we like take that lesson or that argument for Brexit and apply it to U.S. politics?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like honestly, I think Eric Weinstein said some pretty great things on this, where like part of the thing that people are were frustrated by in 2016 is like this idea that the Democratic Party had been sort of like co-opted by elites that didn't particularly care about, you know, the will of the people. And that a lot of this stuff has been couched in, you know, moral arguments where it's like, oh, like you should care about, you know, you should care about the third world, or you should care about like, you know, like the folks in Mexico, right? Where in reality, a lot of the trade stuff that's been going on, right? It's like, if I think about like things which have had a massive impact on climate change, right? One of the things that has had a massive impact on climate change was like moving so much of our manufacturing over to China where there's no ability for us to regulate it, right? And like reducing that autonomy. And like, it's hilarious that, you know, in the early 90s, the person who was advocating most loudly for opening up the relationship with China and, you know, moving most of our manufacturing over there was Al Gore. Right. So like, you know, Al Gore in his like geopolitical stuff made it such that the US can't actually have that huge an influence on like total, you know, like total reduction in greenhouse gases, at least for manufacturing. Right. So so I think there's something to the skepticism that the folks who are claiming to be, you know, for the oppressed and for the disenfranchised seem to have been like a little bit engaged in you know, more interested in multinational corporations and those kinds of things. So I like understand, and I also just generally buy Andrew Yang's sort of argument of like people aren't looking at the problems that got Donald Trump elected. They aren't looking at the fact that, you know, we automated and I think also exported away millions of manufacturing jobs across the Midwest. We are in the midst of this like fourth industrial revolution that is having huge implications on the nature of work. And we have like a really stressed out population that's living paycheck to paycheck. You know, like what is it, like more than 50% of Americans couldn't afford a $500 bill that like came as a surprise. So
is that higher or lower than 30 years ago? Do you have any insight?
I'm pretty sure that like the amount of economic instability in the United States is like the precariat is at an all-time high. I don't know if it's an all-time high, but it seems it
certainly feels like it, whether it is or isn't. And I think that's actually an interesting point here, which is we're not doing a lot of understanding it's a complex system, and we're also not doing a lot of fact-based things. We're doing a lot of feeling-based things, but a lot of decisions are emotional at their core. So this all intuitively makes sense to me, but it's interesting because I think how did you describe your political beliefs? As like a collective autonomy or something like that?
Like atomic communitarianism, or like, you know, like
atomic communitarianism,
or like libertarian. Well, it's just this idea of like, I wouldn't call myself libertarian because I don't believe that like, I don't really buy this idea that like individuals are purely individuals, right? Or like that individuals are an island and that like, you know, there is such a like homo economicus rational actor, right?
Sure.
Like folks are shaped by their environment, and one of the important decisions that we have to make are like, what are the constraints that we place on our environment? And what are I think a lot of things like, you know, there's a good translation game, right? Of, you know, I heard from a friend who's a bit more conservative libertarian talking about how she used to be like a bit triggered when people were talking about, you know, systemic bias or like, you know, systemic problems, right? Like in racism and those kinds of things. And when she sort of made a mental switch of systemic problems being incentive problems, she was like, oh yeah, the thing you're describing is completely correct, right? And I think that there are like lots of situations where we have pretty bad incentives set up, and incentives such that like, you know, folks are following their incentives and their incentives are causing them to, you know, maximize negative externalities on a lot of people that they don't know and don't have any relationships with, whether that's through, you know, moving a bunch of manufacturing jobs over to a place with lower regulation where, you can give workers shittier working conditions and you can make a higher profit, and you can like disrupt a bunch of communities that have been built around those jobs, right? Or like the mechanical turkinization of everything, where like you can break work up into like micro components that sort of remove the sovereignty from workers, and people are following their incentives, right? And so if you're thinking about how to like structure society, you want to think about incentive design, and you want to think about, okay, how do we create a system that is actually like maximizing the most good for people, and maximizing sort of the health of the system long term. And in the case of Brexit, right, like that's having that more local autonomy in terms of how Britain is going to govern itself might have some consequences, but if it improves error correction in the long run, it's gonna make for much better policy. It's gonna make for a much better like life for a lot of people. So yeah, I guess that's my sort of like my stance on things is like, I don't have a problem with government. I don't have a problem with us like making collective decisions about what we can and can't do, and like trying to like tweak the incentive structures that exist. But in general, I also have a lot more faith in distributed intelligence, right? And basically like ways of getting insight or like good ideas from people who don't have like institutional like blue checks on their Twitter account, right? So.
And this is actually an interesting point where I won't go into the rabbit hole here because that'll tack another hour onto this this discussion. But one of the things that I'm writing down, which is a new idea that's triggered for me from this discussion, is this idea that if you think of society or culture or what have you as in development, right? It's kind of helpful to use the model of a child, right? How do you raise a good child? You let them make mistakes, but you let them make mistakes that don't kill them, right?
Yep, exactly.
So you kind of encourage them to have their own version of error correction.
Yep.
And so if you think of kind of good societal structure, it's a structure that will allow you to make the mistakes that you should be allowed to make. Right?
Exactly.
Rather than trying to save you from yourself, because obviously we are dealing with incredibly complex systems that are hard to predict. So, Gore talking about, moving stuff, kind of international trade, moving manufacturing into China. I'm actually not familiar with that, but I'm taking you at your word that it's true. That has one of those things where it could drive, 100 different kind of unintended consequences out of it, including kind of geopolitical security, including, trade partnerships, economics, etc. And all of those things are hard to predict. And so that brings me to this point of like, if we should be allowed to make the mistakes that we should be allowed to make, the ones that don't kill us, then how we organize and how we don't organize, how we organize and disorganize as cultures should be one of those things. And there's an argument for the place where I don't actually know the right answer is when decisions should be default technocratic or default individual. Because when you get to this kind of, as individuals, we often don't understand the whole broad context. We don't have, think of it as like the average user being able to vote on feature development for Facebook. And I think that's actually a good example. If we made it that you could deactivate Facebook and leave, then you don't get to control what Facebook is, right? You're about to say something here. You're going to go in a different direction.
I was going to say voice and exit, right? Like those are like the two ways that you can influence a group that you're a part of, right? Is either you have voice, like in the case of like a labor union or something like that, that like, can change policies or like, has a seat at the table for decision making, or exit. That's one of the challenges you've got with these, these social networks is your only option is exit. But when they have, the sort of like compound interest of network effects where like, all of your friends are there, all of your friends are not somewhere else, right? You really don't have that much exit opportunity unless you're going to like, remove yourself from the commons, right?
Well, and this is, I think, true. I think that's actually a very good example of politics today, right? We have some voice. I mean, certainly voting creates structures for this.
Yeah, I mean, but there's a whole other problem in the United States where the I'm trying to think, what's her name? I think it was Nate. No, it wasn't Nate Silver. She was in Jessica Lawrence, I think, like from the Hunger Games, had a
Oh,
great video where she was sort of talking about this magic number of 30%, where it really doesn't matter how much popular support a given bill has going into Congress. Like we have this sort of notion in our democracy that like, if something is like very widely supported, it will like pass Congress. But pretty universally, a bill entered into Congress has about a 30% chance of passing, whether there's zero support for it or 100% support for it. So there's clearly this like big problem in the United States democratic system where, especially at the federal level, there's actually almost no error correction in terms of like public policy, right? There's no place where a change in public sentiment influences that. And some folks might be like, well, we have a republic. It's not supposed to be democratic. It's not supposed to be the will of the people influences government. But like the degree to which there is a separation between how people think that the government in the United States works and how it actually works, I think is one of the biggest challenges that we have right now. And that's where I think, I happen to think that if you're trying to eliminate the incentive structure, which does create corruption in a sense, right? Like corruption is basically just like it has all the sort of moral connotations to it. But I think the system can be corrupt because it creates incentives which are not aligned with the way that we think the system is supposed to be aligned. Right now, the incentive structure is if you are a congressman or if you are a senator, you're having to spend about 70% of your time fundraising in order to just make enough money to win the next election, to buy the ads that you need to do to mobilize the ground force that you need to mobilize. So the incentives are set up that you have to raise a shit ton of money. And the only really effective way to do that is from large donors and bundlers and, special interests. And so we end up with a system where, like the will of the people doesn't translate at all because the incentives are aligned with who can raise the most money. And so that's where I think if you want to change those systems and you want to have like structural change, that's one of the reasons I think the most important, it's probably the second most important. I do think universal basic income is another place where you're actually like putting cognition at the edges, right? You're saying like instead of just like putting all the decision-making power in the mayor or the congressperson for a federal jobs guarantee, where we're going to channel all the money through institutions of power to then get distributed in terms of deciding what should happen. I prefer something where you're broadly spreading capital across a large number of people, and if the person decides that the most effective use of their capital is for them to take care of their sick grandmother and stay home and raise their kids, right? Or go play guitar, right? If they decide that's the most effective use of their capital, that's the most I prefer that distributed cognition, allow people to make some errors. But I think the more important policy from Andrew Yang that I really like is this democracy dollars idea, where you basically give every citizen a voucher of $100 a year that they can put onto, and the fact that this would wash out corporate money by a factor of 8, even if only half the people actually end up using these $100 vouchers. I think that's the thing that actually leads to a change in the incentive structure for government as a whole, which would allow you to actually start tackling some much larger problems. So those two things where you're creating a system, from a centralized perspective, you're changing the incentive structure and then distributing intelligence much more broadly, right? That's the place where I think centralized authority can be really useful. Is like when the centralized authority is redirecting resources such that you get more distributed intelligence.
There's an interesting point where I think you and I may disagree slightly, or at least I don't intuitively agree.
Yeah.
Where I think great technocrats are functionally like incentive designers that should bias towards simplicity and longer term thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think we'd probably agree on that. I think we'd also probably agree that there's startlingly few people in current politics and the current political system who are great technocrats.
Yeah.
There are some that are good, some that are medium, some that are bad.
Yeah. I think it's interesting to note that in China, the number one occupation before entering government is engineering, whereas in the United States it's being a lawyer, right? And so I think there's something that's pretty significant there in terms of what kind of people are being selected for by the culture. What
do you think the selection difference between lawyer and engineer is? Because both of those seem like structured thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it has to do with the I think it's one of those things of like attracts like. right? Of like, if you have a government that was like built by lawyers, like the people who they're going to sort of like handpick and say like, okay, you get the endorsement of the party, are like people who think like them. And
how do lawyers and engineers think differently though?
Well, one is a pretty adversarial basis, right? Mm-hmm. So one is basically thinking about like, okay, like my job is to persuade.
How do I win the argument?
How do I win the argument? Which I think is also like pretty useful, right? And the engineer is like thinking about overall system construction. I think both of them are like not necessarily the best suited for incentive design, but like there's good things about lawyers and there's good things about engineers, right? But
what profession or background would be the best suited for incentive design?
I don't know. Like, I mean, there is like something where, so it's interesting, right? Because I think one of the challenges that folks have with like the business community, right, is that it's hard to tell because there's so much incentive for people to sort of maximize the negative externalities. Yeah. And to basically capture as much value as possible, as opposed to creating as much value as possible. Yeah. And you can measure the value that's captured, but you can't measure the value that's created. So I think there's a challenge because like my first instinct would be to like say, oh well, like like business people, right? Yeah. But the challenge with that is that a lot of times the folks who are really successful in finance or in business are the folks who are successful at value capture. Which is not necessarily the same thing as the folks who are really good at like expanding the commons and creating a bunch of uncaptured value. I think there's like some nice things in general in startups of like you have to create a huge amount of value from very little, but like there's nothing inherent in startups that says that you're going to be creating more value than you have. Like you can't easily tell the difference between somebody who's capturing 1% of the value and using that to like perpetuate a feedback loop that allows them to create exponentially more value versus somebody who's capturing 90% of the value that they create. And so I think it's a tricky thing. I don't have a great answer for that.
Yeah, there's also a difference between penchant for systems thinking, which I think is important. Like the ability to hold a lot of complexity in your head is important. Yeah. And I'm not convinced that business tests for that. I think it rewards it, but I don't think it tests for it.
Yeah. I do think there's some like, I guess I'm biased towards like, I guess iconoclastic scientists that are like really trying to do like paradigm shifting work, but it's going to be a small minority in any profession, I think, that is actually like trying to like figure out, okay, what are the things that other people are considering edge cases that are actually central to like the flaw in the paradigm. And I think you see that like it's pretty rare. Most people are going to be doing incremental work in whatever field they're in.
It's funny. I've got in any one of these that I feel like goes well. I end with more questions than I started with.
Yeah.
So I've got a huge chunk of those. I also don't want to burn another cool. hour of your day.
Yeah.
I did ask a couple of people like, what should I talk about? And the one that I had on my list but not as strongly, and I probably would have skipped it if I didn't get a bunch of people asking about it. Yeah. Is why you love Clojure.
Oh yeah.
And like what you think the tool enables. So give me like just a high level, and I'm not a super technical guy. Give me like a little bit of a background on why you love that and why you hate Rails.
All right. So there's a great little like, it's a GitHub gist. It's sort of this essay this guy wrote of like Clojure is for type B programmers, and it sort of opens with like, I'm sitting here like doodling on a stack of overdue bills, like drinking a cheap beer and eating a gas station donut, thinking about why I love Clojure. And like those are like very related. And this was from a guy who built a pretty successful Rust IDE. And so you can take like Clojure and Rust as two sort of different like paradigms. Like Rust is like a strongly typed static language that like is like all about like provability and like secure, like like you have to sort of like have a top-down model of how everything's going to work to like do it really well. Whereas Clojure is it's a Lisp. So it's a place where like code is data. You're thinking in terms of like data and functions, which are these like everything you have is like these data and functions, but code itself is data. So they're sort of this like isomorphism there. But it's really good for just like evolutionary thinking, right? It's really good for experimentation. It's really good for like kind of like mucking around in the dark. when you don't quite know what you're building. And you're gradually building pieces that you then reuse in the creation of other pieces. It sort of, I really, really like Rich Hickey's thoughts in general. Like a lot of his talks are, I think, pretty accessible to a non-technical audience, although they're more resonant if you understand more of what he's talking about. But the emphasis on simplicity and the emphasis on composability of, like, you know, when you have a problem, trying to break it down to its most discrete parts, and then building each solution in such a way that you can layer them on top of each other to build a bigger recipe. You know, thinking in terms of, like, not in terms of molecules, but like atoms that become molecules, and molecules that become organisms, and organisms that become, you know, ecosystems. So I think it's just been hugely influential in, like, even the design of Roam as a product. Like, I think that, like, if you know, the Clojure programmers who, like, start using Roam are like, yeah, this feels like a Lisp environment, right? Like you're, and so I think that's another thing that we're trying to do with Roam, is, like, sort of have that, like, think about the atomic units of your thoughts and think about how you can, like, build them together. Like, basically, like implement a little bit of the, like, Lisp philosophy of problem solving and of knowledge management into, you know, like, because I think of code as basically just a diamond of crystallized thought, right? You know, it's sort of magical, right? You're conjuring these, like, abstract ideas into a reified physical thing that now, like, lives on a machine and operates it. But, like, you're summoning these demons and then, you know, getting these demons to work together. So yeah, I think that's one of the reasons, like, philosophically, why I've liked Clojure a lot. And I also think, you know, I was pretty influenced by Paul Graham. And so some of his early writing, he sort of talked about, like, well, you know, people talk about how writing Lisp will make you a better programmer. Why would you not write in a language that's going to make you a better programmer when, you know, you're talking to a computer? It's not like Latin where you need other people to talk to. But the other reason I like Clojure is, like, there is a really great community of people who are both extremely pragmatic, right? The difference between Clojure and a lot of other Lisps is it's extremely pragmatic. It's very, like, you know, most of the code that we use is often, like, React components that, you know, might have been written in TypeScript, but we can call those components really easily. So, you know, we're able to use all the advantages of a much larger ecosystem of whether it's Java or JavaScript. So we're not sort of, like, trapped in our own little environment with only a handful of other people, but, you know, there's a really good community of people who are trying to take great ideas from every other language community and import those into the Clojure ecosystem. So it seems, yeah, a bunch of it's cultural.
It's funny because there's a thread, I think, in what I've heard you talk about here and on Twitter and such, and Roam and you know, org mode and startup building in general, right? Which is this idea of, like, trying to solve a problem in the way where you would have to if you weren't able to just turn the light on everything at once. Like, I think we call mucking around in the dark, right? Like, trying to solve this kind of unknowable, like, you can't just map it all out at once and then go tackle it, right? You've got to kind of, you know, execute as you go. And I'll test this out with you, but I've heard you talk about a couple of things. One is kind of simplicity, which I'll talk about as, like, reducibility. Like, you can reduce it down to an understandable model. You can make it easier to understand. And then composability, which is capture, and those two interplay. And I hear a lot of, like you just call it pragmatism with Clojure, and I think there's related concepts in Roam and founding and these kind of things, which is really that's not a universal function of a way to muck around in the dark, but it's kind of a worldview thing. Like, it's programming, like, you know, you as the player going through the challenge. Am I on the right path, off the right path?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I like the thing that I think about with Clojure, right? It's like you're writing a language for yourself, right? Like, so this is another. There's a quick tangent. It's like, so one of my favorite thinkers is, like, Doug Engelbart, who's, you know, credited as inventing the mouse, but I think really invented like the whole idea of, like, user interface design and, like, you know, human computer interaction really, like, started in many ways at SRI. And like, so he had a paper in, like, 1962 called Augmenting the Human Intellect. And it was sort of like the conceptual framework for a lot of the work that ended up, you know, they were
some of the earliest people who were even using screens, and the idea of typing and having it like come up on a screen that you could see and then editing that text, right? Yeah, this idea that there are sort of like four ways that an augmentation system is a human who has artifacts, language, and methods in which they can be trained. And that basically like, language is this like, this like crystallization of a concept. Like when we have a word for something, right, we can use that word in a sentence, and eventually whole sentences become new words. And then you can basically build up these abstractions, which give you greater conceptual leverage over reality. To think things that you couldn't previously have thought before, right? Like growing your vocab grows your domain of thinkable thoughts. And so I think that's the overall like trend that we've got, is like, if we're trying to see things that we haven't seen before, we need in some ways to like expand our language in order to even be able to think those thoughts. And so that's one of the things that I think sort of ties like Clojure and Rome together, is like you're trying to be able to like, in each piece of work that you're doing, expand the domain of thoughts you are capable of thinking. And like that sort of like conceptual leverage is like, necessary to solve problems that are like currently not solvable by you, right?
Yeah.
Like a problem clearly stated is a problem half solved. Half of the work that you have to do is like, how do I even describe this problem? How do I name it? How do I think about what it is? And every name is going to be, there is sort of like lossy compression, right? There's like, you're going to name things wrong, right? Like you're going to like your description of things is never going to sort of capture the fullness of reality of what's going on. Like, another paper I really like is called Fuck Nuance, where it sort of talks about like, this trend in sociology research of everybody sort of asking for more and more nuance in every paper that's being made. But like all models are false, some are useful, right? Yeah. Your model is going to, like, by virtue of being an abstraction, lack a bunch of nuance. But if it has explanatory power, like it can still be really useful. You don't want to throw out things just because they don't capture everything, but you also want to be able to like, go back and see, okay, well, what wasn't captured by that? Is there another explanatory system that covers that better, that they could intersect?
Yeah, Eric had a bunch of stuff on Peter Thiel kind of doing this almost structurally, like wanting to get to the simplest possible like mimetic transfer, even if it was lossy, right? How far can you reduce it to make it understandable?
Yep, exactly.
And communicable. Cool. By the way, what's the difference between Rome and localocracy? Like what's the different approach you're taking building Rome? Like, this definitely feels like you've learned some things from the localocracy experience that you're not, recreating or that you are.
The number one thing is that in localocracy we started with a thing that required network effects to be successful, right? So like, if you're trying to have a commons to influence public opinion, it doesn't really matter until you get critical mass, right? Like, and so there's very little incentive for any one person to be the first person to start really contributing. And if you're the second person to contribute and the first person has put a bunch of good arguments for why your thing is bad, you have like more incentive to like ignore the thing and like not draw attention to it than you do to like put forward good arguments. So I think the biggest thing that I took away from that first startup was, hey, even if I want to eventually do a thing that is going to be a collaborative tool, that is going to be, a way for people to disagree effectively and to like, to have conflict, it has to start as a single player tool. It has to start as a thing that is useful to individuals. And it might go many years as being primarily a single player tool before you start to like even worry about those network effects, especially if you're interested in, because every time we launched a new town, we were starting from scratch. And the thing that I wanted to avoid was, I happen to think that really good ideas often come from the intersection of different fields. So it's like, if we want somebody to be able to take some ideas from synthetic biology, and remix those with some ideas in physics, and then remix those with some ideas in public policy, you don't want to have critical mass in all three of those areas before those intersections can start to happen. So that's where we sort of said, okay, we're going to scale it way back and say, how do you collaborate with yourself before you worry about collaborating with other people? And that's the thing that got me interested in, like, as a person who's reading pretty widely, how do I remix the ideas in the different books that I'm reading? Because I don't need every author in each of those books to be using Rome. I can just, copy paste my Kindle highlights and
Right.
start to remix the ideas myself. And I don't need to be dependent on other people in the system.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
One of the other things that I'm picking up on as a user, and I could be wrong here, is it feels like Roam is stable in a way that other companies aren't. And I guess what I mean by that is I don't think it's going to be fickle to like success metrics in a way. And I think that's predominantly because I think you're iconoclastic.
Cool.
Which is like, hey, if the thing runs out of money, I have some weird instinct that you'll like spend 12 years toiling in the dark working on it anyway.
It's probably because I did, for like, I like just like poured all the earnings from my first company into like a really long research period of the dark until I ran out of money and then had to start raising. Right. I mean, like our first couple of years, we had revenue before we really fundraised, because we basically just found a bunch of resource organizations that liked the prototype and were willing to pay us to develop it. But yeah, like we live pretty cheap, and we were able to make a small amount of funding go a really long way. So I think
like ramen profitable now, or
so we're probably going to turn on payments in the next like couple of months. So like we were ramen profitable through like those enterprise contracts, but
sure.
There's problems with that where we, especially now that we're worried about scale, I'd rather be focused on just like regular users than enterprise contracts. So we're probably going to be doing like almost no enterprise stuff for a while. But we've just we've raised a bit of money and we've got quite a long runway based on that. And also I expect that we'll be like pretty profitable this year. So
cool.
But even if we weren't, like, it's just we were able to build it with 2 people, and I plan on working on this till I die. So that's fun. It's like it's the thing that I want to be working on, right? It's the thing that I've been thinking about for now like about 12 years. So and there's a lot of stuff. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I wrote up all of our open questions. And not all of our open questions. I did some, maybe like 3 hours of it last night. But like, there's a lot of stuff we haven't figured out yet. There's a huge amount that we're working on for the next couple of years. So even if other people, my hope is that like backlinks and the atomicity of like individual units of thought and the ability to remix things, I hope that the rest of the industry tries to play catch up. And that we get those things in Google Docs and Notion and Dropbox Paper and all those other things. But for us, it's like really just the start of what we're working on. And so I hope that we can, but I hope we can move the industry in a direction that is a little bit more towards this like knowledge mapping.
Well, the job of the founders to bring the future forward, whether they capture the value from that is undetermined. As we were talking about before. All right. Well, hey, you've been super generous of time, and I think had basically no idea what you were getting into before doing this.
Oh no, this was fantastic. This is a great. Like I like these. I haven't. No one's asked me about my thoughts on Brexit in an interview originally about Rome, so that was funny. Hopefully we've compressed some ideas and created some thought artifacts that could be useful. And I'll just like caveat, like, I don't know anything about what I'm talking about. So I will play Cunning Sam's Law. And if people are like, hey, like this particular thought that you articulated is just complete bullshit, I'm very happy to hear like rebuttals to any of those points. But yeah, this has been a lot of fun.
And you are an entertaining follow on Twitter. So for the folks that want to rebut you or just follow along as the by the way, I don't think you're the Nassim Taleb of knowledge management. I think you're the Hunter S. Thompson of tech founding.
Yes.
Awesome. So there
great.
You go.
Great.
So for folks who want to follow along with the wacky wild journey, where are you on Twitter?
Yeah, Gonzo. I'm CONAWS or no CONAW. So it's I'm from Boston, and the way that I remember a friend, texted me. They were like, "Hey, Connor," and so this was like when I was like, oh yeah, like Kana, that sounds like how like a lot of people pronounce my name. So Kana on Twitter, CONAW. So
there you go. Well, maybe we'll do another one of these at some point. And at the very least, we should talk about we didn't even get into the whole fact of like Boston upbringing being a part of iconoclastic.
Yeah.
I think that's part of it.
Yeah. Like tea parties and shit.